the Canova report made a recommendation that in Northern Ireland, as a society, we should have a day of reconciliation on the 21st of June. Can you tell us what you think would be the significance of that?
I think that a recommendation to have June 21st dedicated to a day of reconciliation would be really important. I'm not sure that people here really understand what reconciliation means, what it looks like. It was beautiful today that we heard from so many different people about the importance of perseverance and courage, and John Paul Lederach's concepts of mercy and justice and truth and peace. As someone who was a signatory to the peace agreement, I wish we'd had the opportunity to have had a day like this where the parties to the agreement could have understood what we'd just signed and what would be asked of us. But 26 years later, it's good that we've held this, and I think it needs to go across the whole of Northern Ireland.
When you were talking in the service, you were referencing a memory long time ago of driving a bus to Corrymeela. Can you just unpack that a little bit for us?
At the time, I volunteered with Gingerbread, an organisation who got its name from gingering the government up for more bread. It was there to support one-parent families. And we made a request of Corrymeela to have a retreat and some respite away from the troubles out of Belfast. So it was my job to drive the bus and to take the prisoners' wives, the women who had been surviving domestic violence, the women who had been married to men in the IRA, married to British Army soldiers, police officers. They were from everywhere. And it was their first time that they had an opportunity to sit in Corrymeela and exchange what was really the issue of commonality between them all, which was their lack of power, how abused they felt, how to survive and cope. And it was there in Corrymeela. And I remember us sleeping in the old wooden house in bunk beds, collecting the rainwater coming in through the roof on a bucket. But, you know, we sat down around the table together, and it's always at the kitchen table and the dinner table where you hear the most profound things being said. And that was reconciliation. And that was 50 years ago. And I wish we had have built on that and kept and sustained it. And a regret I have at the peace talks is that we didn't push more for more to be done on victims and survivors. We got a few words in, we got some lines in. I'm glad that we did. Had we not been there might not have been any. And it was all very rushed. And in some ways we give our power away, because mostly when people sit down to make peace, it's the armed groups that are at the table or the constitutional parties. It's very rarely anybody from the victims and survivors sector. And we're grateful that we managed to have a section called reconciliation. But I do, and today, which was regarded as a day of lament, that would be one of my laments. But, you know, let's build from today on what we could have and should have done. There's much work to be done, as I know, and I was very conscious when I stood at that rostrum and looked down. I could see all the various people who are the responsible ones. And that was my message. As the responsible ones, what are we going to do now?
Is there a memory you have of a relationship or a conversation even with someone that first opened you up to the other side or the need for some kind of sense of reconciliation? Was it family or anything like that?
Actually, it was there. My work with Women's Aid and later with WAVE, that when I realised the hurt and the harm that had been done to both sides, and the pain caused, and how this was being passed from generation to generation. And I realised how much work we would need. But again, we weren't doing anything on trauma counselling. We weren't doing anything on therapies that were needed. In fact, we were prescribing medication, the wrong way to go about it. And that's all seen as soft stuff. That's not seen as security reforms and criminal justice reforms and sharing governance or power sharing, but it's one of the most important parts of sustaining a peace. Truth, doing justice, doing it in humble ways, as I said, under the radar, which was Corrymeela was good at, and so was we of.
I'm just thinking of some anecdote from the Good Friday Agreement that talks.
When Reg Empey from the Ulster Unionist said he didn't understand how 10 men could starve themselves to death for an ideology, and he had to keep thinking, this cause must be something that I don't understand. Now, they weren't talking to each other, Sinn Féin and the Ulster Unionists. The Ulster Unionists refused to engage except through the chairperson. And I remember at that moment thinking, this is where we need to be engaging and speaking. How come we arrived at a situation where 10 men died in prison on a hunger strike? That needs to be explained. Then there was another moment when Gerry Adams's 2 nephews were killed in a car accident on the Falls Road. And when he came back in to the room, they expressed their condolences. And so I thought, does it take tragedies to actually raise people up and see that we're all suffering here, and to understand the humanity? And I thought that was, again, a moment of graciousness. But there were very few. But they were important.
Yeah, and you got the. Can you just tell us the story of the Women's Coalition's role in getting putting someone to meet Mo Mowlam in the? Would that be? Can you tell that?
Well, it was on the last night before Good Friday, and we realised there was nothing in the agreement about victims, and that if we were going to sell it in the referendum, go out to the people and say you need to be able to say yes to this, they needed to have some sense that they were in the agreement, either on the line or somewhere they could see themselves. So we tried to make that argument to the officials, and they were saying, no, it's okay, we've set up a commission to look at that afterwards. And I said, well, that isn't going to wear. So we knew Mo Mowlam, like us, would be using the women's toilet that night. And so we placed someone, Pearl Sager, my colleague at the table, and said, when she comes down, let us know. And we'll go in and we'll say, here's what our proposals are. And she was convinced that what we were saying was much needed. And when she came out, the officials were cross with us and said, what were you doing? And we said, it's okay. It's been done, solved, wore the T-shirt, on we're going. And that's sad to say, it's how some of those words got into the agreement. But it also shows you the importance of personal relationships and working on the corridors and outside those big plenaries. And making sure that if you've got an issue that's really important for the future of peace, then there's no point in crying about it afterwards. Get the words in and then fight to make it work.
And those words in the agreement, do you remember what they were?
Yes, it was about, we should have used the words reparations. Instead, we said there would be resources for victims, and that work would be done. The agreement opens with beautiful words, we will remember them, and it will be a fresh start. But we had to do more than remembering. And in that section then, there are a few lines about work would be taken forward on victims and the resources would be set aside. But it should have been much more.